Coral reefs, sometimes referred to as the rainforests of the sea due to the vast abundance of life they sustain. They are found across the world, though mainly in the tropics. Together, they make up a mere 0.1% of the ocean's surface area, or roughly half the size of France. Despite this meagre size, they are home to 25% of the ocean's creatures, and over 5,000 species of fish make their homes on the reefs. Coral reefs are actually made up of millions of small individual animals called polyps, which form large colonies. Each polyp secretes a hard carbonate exoskeleton, which provides support and protection for the body of each polyp. When a polyp dies, new polyps build their exoskeleton on top of the old one. Over time, new reefs are formed. Coral reefs are located in areas where the seas are warm and relatively shallow, with the optimum temperature being between 26 and 31 degrees centigrade. Such seas tend to be devoid of nutrient-rich water, usually found in areas of cold water upwellings where corals cannot survive. Because of this, corals have adapted a mutually beneficial relationship with algae to provide their food source. Inside the sac of each coral polyp lives a one-celled algae called zooxanthellae. The algae gives off oxygen during photosynthesis and provides energy that the coral polyp needs to live. In return, the polyp gives the algae carbon dioxide and nitrogen, as well as a protective home within the carbonate exoskeleton. That is why coral reefs grow so near the surface of the water where it is sunniest. The algae needs sunshine for photosynthesis. The relationship between the coral polyps and zooxanthellae is a form of symbiosis. Symbiosis literally means living together and describes relationships between different species. There are 3 types of symbiosis. The first, as in the case of coral polyps and zooxanthellae, is called mutualism. This is where both organisms benefit from the interaction with the other, and neither organism is harmed in the process. Mutualistic relationships can be either facultative, where the relationship is not essential for the survival of either species, or obligate, where the interaction between the 2 species is essential for both their survival. The example of the coral and the algae is an example of obligate mutualism, where without one another, both will die. This explains why coral reef ecosystems are so fragile, given the narrow environmental parameters in which they can flourish. Many of the other plants and animals that live in and around the coral reef have also evolved symbiotic relationships to help in the struggle for survival in what is a deceivingly hostile habitat. One of the most iconic symbols of symbiosis on the reef is that of the clownfish and the stinging anemone. In this mutualistic relationship, the anemone provides a protective home for the clownfish, which is not affected by the stinging cells of the anemone as are other fish. It is believed that the clownfish have evolved a special mucus which is gradually acclimatised to the anemone's sting, so that it no longer views it as prey. When the anemone catches a fish in its tentacles, the clownfish eats any scraps that are left and also feeds on the particles excreted by the anemone. They also keep the anemone free of parasites and algae. In return, the anemone is protected by the clownfish from its predators, and they have also been documented catching fish and feeding the anemone. As well as clownfish, some other species of damselfish are also impervious to the stinging cells of certain anemones, as in the case of this small black damselfish. It is not just the clownfish that keep the anemone free from parasites and algae. As demonstrated here in this carpet anemone, the saddleback clownfish are ever present, but in this case so are a number of small glass cleaner shrimps, delicately combing the surface of the anemone for any small morsels of food. A further example of mutualism can be found in the relationship between the yellow prawn goby and the pistol shrimp. In this relationship, the goby lives in a burrow made and maintained by the industrious shrimp, which just happens to be almost totally blind. Thus, when it emerges from the burrow with its recent excavations, it is open to predation. This is where the goby steps in, by becoming the eyes of the shrimp, in return for the protection of the burrow. The shrimp will usually keep an antenna in constant contact with the goby. If the goby senses danger, it beats its tail against the shrimp's antenna, signalling for it to retreat into the burrow, followed by the goby. As well as being provided with a home, the goby also feeds off small invertebrate exposed by the shrimp's work. It Examples so far have involved symbiotic relationships between two separate species. However, some mutualisms extend beyond this relationship between numerous species. An example of this is the occurrence of cleaning stations on the reef. Fish and other species often travel for considerable distances to attend these cleaning stations, where tiny cleaner wrasse or bronze cleaner partner shrimp swim and hop into the open mouths and gill slits of the fish. Whilst doing this, they remove growths and parasites from the fish that would otherwise cause them illness or harm. The amazing thing about this relationship is that often these fish are predatory and would normally eat smaller fish and crustaceans like the cleaners. At the cleaning stations, however, there is no risk of predation, as the fish patiently wait for the cleaning to be completed. Some instinct tells the larger predators that the cleaners are providing a service that they cannot do without. The cleaners benefit by obtaining a free meal, and the fish benefit by being kept clean and therefore free of illness. As well as mutualism, there are two other forms of symbiosis. Commensalism describes a relationship between two organisms where one benefits and the other is not significantly harmed or helped. An example of this occurs where remora fish attach themselves to the bodies of large pelagic fish such as whale sharks. They attach themselves via a large suction pad on their head, which does not harm the shark. The remora, however, benefits by being afforded protection due to the shark's presence and by the increased access to food as the shark travels. Another form of commensalism is called metabiosis. Metabiosis is where one organism benefits from the death of another organism. An example of this is shown in hermit crabs, which inhabit the empty shells left after the death of a sea snail or other gastropod. As hermit crabs grow, they seek out larger shells to accommodate their growing body. In this case, a white-spotted hermit crab has nearly outgrown its current home and is in the market for a new, larger shell. However, upon closer inspection it appears that the shell is still inhabited by a snail, and so the crab continues on its quest for a larger shell. The third form of symbiosis is called parasitism, which occurs when the symbiont, or parasite, benefits at the expense of the host. An example of this found on the coral reef is that of Christmas tree worms. Christmas tree worms are small filter feeders that feed on planktonic life filtered out of the water. They settle upon coral and bore into the hard coral shell by secreting a mixture of mucus and sand. These secretions form a tube inside the coral, killing the polyps and damaging the coral structure as it does so. Once settled in its tube, the worm then extends its colourful feather-like tentacles out into the water and begins feeding. The worm benefits from the elevated position providing a good flow of water and from the protection afforded to it by its new burrow, whilst the coral polyp is killed. In order to live together, the animals of the reef employ various forms of symbiosis. The examples shown are of only a few in the web of the reef. There are a multitude of connections, and it is important to realise that all things and all the processes on the reef, as in the rainforests of the Amazon or the open plains of the savannah, rely on each other. Coral reefs and tropical waters owe their existence to a symbiotic relationship, that between the coral polyp and the zooxanthellae. Without this mutually beneficial relationship, the whole web of life on a coral reef would fall apart. If we fail to act and do not strive to protect these habitats, the effects will be disastrous for us all.